The clock in the grand drawing room of Ravenshire Hall struck midnight with a hollow, echoing chime. Veronica M. Kroger stood before the Duke's mahogany desk, her hands folded with practiced composure over the worn fabric of her maid's dress. The candlelight cast flickering shadows across the room, making the towering bookshelves and oil portraits seem to lean inward, as though the very walls were listening. At her feet sat a small leather traveling case, hastily packed, its brass clasps catching the light. She watched a drop of candle wax slide down the silver holder on the Duke's desk and felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the kind that had become her constant companion these past 3 months, ever since she'd realized the truth she now carried. "Miss Kroger." The Duke's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He didn't look up from the ledger before him, his pen scratching methodically across the page. Veronica waited. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She counted her breaths, 1, 2, 3, and kept her expression carefully neutral, though beneath her apron, her hand moved instinctively to rest against her still flat abdomen before she caught herself and let it fall back to her side. Finally, Duke William R. Shell set down his pen with the deliberate precision of a man who had never been kept waiting in his life. He looked up. "Veronica M. Kroger." His voice was clipped, devoid of any warmth, as though he were reading from a household inventory. 3 years in my service. Impeccable references from my late mother's household. Currently employed as lady's maid, a position you have executed with adequate competence. Heat prickled at the back of Veronica's neck, but she kept her chin level, her gaze steady. "Your Grace is most kind to say so." "I haven't summoned you for flattery." He leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on the arm, with the careless authority of a man who owned not just this house, but half the county beyond it. His evening coat was midnight blue velvet, perfectly tailored, and his cravat was tied with mathematical precision. He was handsome in the cold, austere way of marble statuary, all sharp jawline and aristocratic severity. His eyes, a pale gray-green, held no softness, no recognition of the night 3 months ago when those same eyes had looked at her with desperate human need. He might have been looking at a stranger. "I've decided," he continued, picking up a sheet of paper and examining it as though it held more interest than she did, "to refresh my household staff. Nothing personal, you understand. Simply a matter of efficiency. My valet suggested that perhaps a younger girl, someone more current with London fashions, might better serve in your position." The words landed like stones in still water, each one sending ripples of humiliation through her. Veronica's hands tightened imperceptibly in the folds of her skirt, her nails pressing crescents into her palms. She should nod. She should accept his reference letter and his month's severance pay and disappear, quietly, gratefully, before he could see the truth written in her body. But she had been a gentleman's daughter once, before her father's gambling debts had forced her into service, and some things ran deeper than survival. "I will, of course, provide a reference," the Duke said, pulling a sealed envelope from his desk drawer. "And a modest sum to see you through until you secure new employment. You've been serviceable." Serviceable. The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Veronica thought of the night his younger brother had died, the way the Duke had appeared at her door in the servants' quarters past midnight, his face ravaged with grief, his perfect composure shattered for the first and only time. The way he'd reached for her, with shaking hands, seeking comfort, seeking warmth, seeking anything to fill the terrible emptiness. The way she'd let him in, let him hold her, let herself believe, for one foolish night, that she was more than a servant to him. the way he'd left before dawn without a word, and never spoken of it again. "I've trained you well," the Duke continued, mistaking her silence for acceptance. "You should have no trouble finding a new position, perhaps with a merchant family or a respectable widow, someone of more modest circumstances than my own." "Your Grace," Veronica said quietly, and something in her tone made him finally, truly look at her, not through her, but at her. "May I speak plainly?" His eyes narrowed slightly, as though she'd committed some minor breach of etiquette. "If you must." "I have served this house with more than competence. I have anticipated your needs before you voiced them. I have managed your chambers, your wardrobe, your correspondence, and your privacy with absolute discretion." She paused, letting the weight of that last word settle. "And now you dismiss me, as though I were a worn pair of gloves you've decided to replace." A muscle ticked in the Duke's jaw. "Miss Kroger, I hardly think I understand perfectly, Your Grace." She kept her voice steady, though fury and heartbreak warred in her chest. "You need not expect further. You have made your position abundantly clear." "Good." He picked up his pen again, already dismissing her. "Then we understand each other. I trust you'll be gone by morning." He paused, then covered with the casual cruelty of a man who naturally selecting his own other. "You must understand, Miss Kroger, while I appreciate your years of service, I can hire 50 like you." The words struck like a physical blow. Veronica felt something inside her crystallize, harden into diamond-sharp resolve. She looked at this man, this cold, arrogant man who had held her with desperate tenderness one night and dismissed her like rubbish the next, and made her choice. She would not beg. She would not plead. She would not tell him about the child growing inside her, the child with his blood, his aristocratic features, his ancient lineage. She would not give him the power to control her fate, to marry her out of duty, or cast her out in shame. She would simply disappear. "Then do it, Your Grace," she said, her voice soft as silk and sharp as steel. The Duke's head snapped up, his expression caught between shock and offense. "What did you say?" "I said," Veronica repeated, meeting his eyes with perfect, fearless calm. "Do it. Hire 50 like me. I wish you the very best of luck." She curtsied with flawless formality, the kind of curtsy her mother had taught her as a child, when she'd still been Miss Veronica Kroger, daughter of a gentleman, not Veronica the servant. Then she turned, picked up her traveling case with steady hands, and walked toward the door. "Miss Kroger." The Duke's voice held a note she'd never heard before. Uncertainty. "Wait." But Veronica didn't wait. She didn't pause. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing the tears that burned behind her eyes, or the way her heart was shattering into pieces. She walked through the door, through the corridors she had traversed 1,000 times, past the portraits of Shell ancestors who had never learned the difference between power and worth. The night air hit her face as she stepped into the courtyard, where a hired carriage waited, arranged in secret that afternoon. As the carriage pulled away from Ravenshire Hall, Veronica allowed herself one moment, just one, to place her hand over her abdomen, where the Duke's child grew in secret darkness. "You'll never know," she whispered to the receding lights of the manor. "You'll never know what you've lost." And she disappeared into the night, taking with her the secret that would haunt William R. Shell for the rest of his days. The secret that he had dismissed, not just a servant, but the mother of his child, and the only woman who had ever truly seen the man beneath the title. The Duke stood frozen in his study, staring at the empty doorway, his pen still clutched in his hand. Something felt wrong. Something felt catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. But by the time he reached the courtyard, the carriage was gone, swallowed by darkness, and Veronica M. Kroger had vanished without a trace. William R. Schell had always believed that distance was a form of mercy. He stood at the window of his private chambers 3 days before that midnight dismissal, watching the autumn rain streak down the glass, and reflected on the orderly perfection of his household. Everything functioned like clockwork. Everyone knew their place. It was exactly as it should be. Behind him, Veronica moved through the room with her characteristic quiet efficiency, laying out his evening clothes, checking the fire, ensuring the water in the basin was precisely the temperature he preferred. She had been doing this for 3 years, and in all that time, she had never once required correction. He didn't turn to look at her. He never did during these routine tasks. It was easier that way, to maintain the necessary separation between master and servant, between the Duke of Ravenshire and the woman who dressed him, who knew which waistcoat he'd choose before he spoke, who understood without words when he needed silence and when he required his correspondence. 3 years ago, his mother had hired Veronica from a respectable family fallen on hard times. "She's educated beyond her current station," the Dowager Duchess had said, "and she has the most essential quality in a servant. She knows when to be invisible." His mother had been right. Veronica was a ghost, a shadow, a perfectly trained instrument of domestic precision. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them. His chambers were always immaculate, his schedule flawlessly managed, his private life protected with absolute discretion. She asked no questions, offered no opinions, and never presumed familiarity. William had known servants who grew too comfortable, who began to believe that years of service granted them the right to friendship with their betters. Veronica had never made that mistake. She curtsied, said, "Yes, Your Grace," and "No, Your Grace," and disappeared when her tasks were complete. It was perfect, bloodless, safe. He thought of the morning she'd first arrived. A young woman with intelligent eyes and careful posture, her references impeccable, her manner professionally distant. He'd barely glanced at her. Servants were interchangeable after all. Competent ones simply required less frequent replacing. Over 3 years, she had become part of the architecture of his life. He no longer noticed her efficiency the way one stopped noticing the regularity of one's own heartbeat. She was simply there, a constant presence that required no acknowledgement. Until the night, everything changed. But William didn't allow himself to think of that night. That night 3 months ago when his brother Richard had died in a riding accident, and he'd found himself standing in Veronica's doorway at midnight, his composure shattered, his careful control obliterated by grief. That night when she'd opened the door in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, and hadn't said a word, had simply stepped aside and let him in. That night when he'd been weak. No, he'd locked that memory away with the same ruthless discipline he applied to everything. It had been an aberration, a moment of human frailty he would never repeat. By morning, he'd restored the proper order of things. He'd left her quarters before dawn,
returned to his chambers, and never spoken of it again. She'd understood. She'd said nothing. The perfect servant, maintaining the perfect discretion. But lately his valet had mentioned that perhaps a younger lady's maid might better serve his needs. Someone more current with London fashions. Someone without 3 years of
accumulated knowledge of his private habits, his vulnerabilities, his grief. Someone who didn't know what he looked like when his armor cracked. William turned from the window and watched Veronica's reflection in the rain-streaked glass as she smoothed an invisible wrinkle from his evening coat. Her movements were graceful, economical, utterly professional. Yes, he decided. It was time. Time to refresh the household, restore complete control, eliminate any remaining trace of that night's weakness. It was nothing personal. It was simply good business. Veronica had learned to sleep lightly in service. The smallest sound could mean an emergency, a summons, a crisis that required immediate, invisible response. So when the knock came at her door that June night, she was awake instantly, her heart already racing. It was past midnight. No proper summons came at such an hour. She pulled on her dressing gown and opened the door to find the Duke standing in the dim corridor, still dressed in his evening clothes from the dinner party hours earlier. But something was wrong. Terribly, devastatingly wrong. His cravat hung loose around his neck. His hair, always so perfectly groomed, was disheveled, as though he'd been running his hands through it. And his eyes, those cold, grey-green eyes that never betrayed emotion, were red-rimmed and wild with something Veronica had never seen in him before. Raw, ungoverned grief. "Your Grace." She kept her voice carefully neutral, professional, even as alarm bells rang through her body. "Is something—" "Richard is dead." The words came out flat, hollow. "Riding accident. His neck. They said it was instant." Veronica's breath caught. She'd served Richard tea just that afternoon, had laughed at one of his terrible jokes while he charmed the kitchen maids. Lord Richard Shell, the Duke's younger brother by 3 years, warm where William was cold, open where William was closed, beloved by everyone who knew him. "Your Grace, I'm so—" "Don't." William held up a hand, and she saw it trembling. "Don't say you're sorry. Don't say anything. I can't. I can't hear platitudes. I can't be the Duke right now. I can't be strong and composed and proper. I can't!" His voice cracked, actually cracked, and Veronica watched 3 years of perfect aristocratic control shatter like glass. She should have curtsied, should have offered condolences in the appropriate form, should have summoned his valet or his steward, or anyone more suitable to comfort a grieving nobleman. Instead, she stepped aside and opened her door wider. William entered her small servants' quarters, like a man walking through fog, barely seeing the narrow bed, the simple washstand, the complete absence of luxury. He stood in the center of the room, his tall frame seeming too large for the space, and Veronica watched as the last of his composure crumbled. "He was everything I'm not," William whispered. "Kind, easy. People loved him without effort. And now he's gone."
"And I'm still here. And it should have been."
"Don't say that." Veronica's voice was sharper than she'd ever used with him. "Don't you dare say that." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time. Not Veronica the servant, the shadow, the invisible presence, but Veronica the woman, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes fierce with conviction, her hand reaching toward him without permission or propriety. What happened next existed outside of time, outside of reason, outside of the rigid social boundaries that governed their entire world. He reached for her. She didn't pull away. The distance between master and servant collapsed in a moment of shared humanity, shared grief, shared desperate need for comfort in a world that had suddenly proven itself cruel and random and unbearably fragile. They crossed the forbidden line together. In the morning, Veronica woke to find the space beside her empty, the sheets already cold. For one brief moment, she'd allowed herself to believe that something had fundamentally changed between them, that in his vulnerability, he'd seen her not as a servant, but as an equal, a woman, a person worthy of more than professional distance. But when she reported for her duties 2 hours later, perfectly composed in her maid's uniform, the Duke barely glanced at her. "The blue waistcoat today," he said, his voice once again clipped and cold. "And I'll need my correspondence organized by afternoon." "Yes, Your Grace." He never mentioned that night, never acknowledged what had passed between them. The invisible wall was rebuilt, higher and thicker than before, as though nothing had happened, as though she'd imagined the way he'd held her, the broken words he'd whispered against her hair, the desperate human need in his touch, as though she hadn't felt her entire world shift on its axis. By September, when her monthly courses failed to arrive for the second time, Veronica finally understood the true cost of that single night of shared grief. She was utterly, devastatingly alone. William prided himself on being a fair employer, certainly fairer than most of his peers, who dismissed servants on whims or without any compensation at all. He'd prepared a generous severance package for Miss Kroger, a full month's wages, an excellent reference, and even a recommendation to Lady Pemberton, who was currently seeking a lady's maid. He expected gratitude, perhaps relief, certainly obedient acceptance. What Hugh did not expect was the way Veronica's hands tightened in the folds of her skirt, the subtle tension that crept into her shoulders, or the flicker of something dangerous in her eyes, before years schooled her expression back to professional neutrality. "I've prepared your reference," he said, sliding the sealed envelope across the desk toward her. "Lady Pemberton is a respectable widow with a modest household. I believe you'd find the position suitable, less demanding
than service here."
Veronica didn't reach for the envelope. She stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on some point just past his left shoulder. "Your Grace is most considerate." Her voice was too careful, too controlled. William frowned slightly, irritated by something he couldn't quite name. Was she angry? Disappointed? Surely she understood this was a business decision, nothing more. She was an intelligent woman. She must see the logic in it. "I've also included a month's severance pay," he continued, determined to be clear about his generosity. "More than adequate to see you through until you secure new employment. You should consider yourself fortunate. Many employers would simply dismiss you without notice." "I am properly grateful for your Grace's magnanimity." There it was again, that slight edge to her tone, so subtle he might have imagined it. William leaned back in his chair, studying her with growing confusion. Why wasn't she simply accepting this gracefully? He was being more than fair. Miss Kroger," he said, allowing a hint of impatience to color his voice, "is there some difficulty I'm not aware of? Some reason you find these arrangements unsuitable?" She finally met his eyes, and for a brief, unsettling moment, William felt as though she were looking straight through his carefully maintained facade into the hollow space beneath. As though she saw everything he worked so hard to hide,
The fear, the loneliness, the desperate need he'd allowed himself to show only once in 3 years. "No difficulty, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I simply wonder why, after 3 years of service you yourself described as impeccable, I'm being dismissed." William stiffened. This bordered on impertinence. "I've explained this is a matter of household efficiency. Nothing personal." "Nothing personal," she repeated, and something in the way she said it made the words sound like an accusation. "Miss Kroger, you're being unreasonable." He picked up his pen, a clear signal that this conversation was concluded. "I've been more than generous. The terms are final. You leave in the morning." She stood there for another moment, and William felt a strange discomfort crawling up his spine. He'd dismissed servants before. It was always a simple, businesslike transaction. They thanked him for his generosity and left. Why was this different? Why did he feel as though he were standing on the edge of some precipice he couldn't see? "Your Grace," Veronica said, her voice steady despite whatever emotion churned beneath the surface. "May I ask one question?" "If you must." He didn't look up from his ledger. "Did that night mean nothing to you at all?" The pen stilled in his hand. Ice flooded his veins, followed immediately by a surge of anger. At her for mentioning it, at himself for the way his heart had suddenly begun to race. "Miss Kroger, I don't know what you're referring to." "Of course not, Your Grace. Forgive me for presuming." The anger crystallized
into something cold and cutting. How dare she bring up that moment of weakness? How dare she remind him of his failure of control, his breach of propriety? He needed her gone. Now, before she could do any more damage to the carefully ordered world he'd rebuilt. "Miss Kroger, you've served adequately, but you must understand." He looked up at her, his voice dripping with aristocratic certainty, delivering the words with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never questioned his own power. "I can hire 50 like you." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Veronica stood perfectly still, her face pale but composed, and William watched as something fundamental shifted behind her eyes. He'd meant to put her in her place, to remind her of the vast gulf between them. Instead, he'd just made the greatest mistake of his life. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Veronica felt them land in her chest, each syllable a separate wound. "I can hire 50 like you." As though 3 years of devoted service, of knowing his preferences before he spoke them, of protecting his privacy and his secrets, counted for nothing. As though the night he'd held her while he wept counted for nothing. As though she, and the life growing inside her, were utterly, completely replaceable. She had a choice in this moment. She could beg, she could plead, she could fall to her knees and explain that she had nowhere to go, no family to take her in, no savings beyond a few precious pounds. She could tell him about the child, watch his face drain of color, watch him scramble to contain the scandal, watch him offer marriage out of duty while his eyes remained cold and distant. Or she could walk away with the one thing he could never take from her, her dignity. Veronica drew in a slow breath, feeling the corset tight around her ribs, feeling the secret weight of new life in her womb. Then she looked at the Duke, really looked at him, memorizing the sharp planes of his face, the set of his jaw, the way candlelight caught in his hair. This cold, controlled man who'd once been vulnerable in her arms.
this arrogant aristocrat who didn't even realize what he was losing. "Then do it, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, as though she were humoring a stubborn child rather than speaking to the man who held her entire future in his careless hands. William's head snapped up, his expression caught somewhere between shock and outrage. "What did you say?" "I said," Veronica met his eyes with perfect, fearless calm. "Do it. Hire 50 like me. I'm certain you'll find the task remarkably simple. After all, as you say, I'm entirely replaceable." She curtsied then, a full, formal curtsy that would have done credit to a duchess addressing the king. Every movement was precise, graceful, utterly correct. The kind of curtsy that said, "I know my place, and I know yours, and I am choosing to leave it." "Miss Kroger." There was something new in his voice now. Uncertainty. Perhaps the first genuine emotion he'd shown since that terrible June night. "I don't think you understand." "On the contrary, Your Grace, I understand perfectly." She straightened, shoulders back, chin high. "I wish you every success in finding my replacement. I'm sure the 50 candidates will be delighted to serve such a considerate employer." She turned, picked up her traveling case with steady hands, walked toward the door with measured steps, neither hurrying nor hesitating. She would not run. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Wait!" The word was sharp, commanding. "We're not finished discussing—" "I believe we are quite finished, Your Grace." Veronica paused at the threshold, but didn't turn around. "Thank you for the reference. I'm sure it will prove most helpful." Then she walked out. Through the study door, through the portrait-lined corridors where shell ancestors glared down at her, through the entrance hall, where the night butler's eyes widened at her unexpected departure. She kept her spine straight, her pace even, her expression serene. Only when she stepped into the waiting carriage, hired that very afternoon in preparation for this moment, because some part of her had known how this conversation would end, did she allow her composure to crack. The carriage lurched forward. Ravenshire Hall's lights grew smaller in the darkness behind her. And finally, blessedly alone, Veronica pressed both hands against her abdomen, feeling for the barely there swell that would soon become impossible to hide. "It's just us now," she whispered to the child. "Just you and me. And I promise you this, you will never know what it feels like to be replaceable. You will never doubt your worth. You will be loved, completely and unconditionally, even if I must love you enough for 2 parents." The tears came then, hot and silent, streaming down her face as the carriage carried her away from the only security she'd known, away from the man who'd fathered her child and dismissed her like rubbish, away from everything familiar and into an uncertain future. But she didn't look back. Behind her, in the grand drawing room of Ravenshire Hall, William R. Shell stood frozen, staring at the empty doorway. His hands trembled slightly. His chest felt oddly tight, as though something vital had been torn away. "Wait," he'd said. But she hadn't waited. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like the beginning of the end of everything. The first replacement lasted 3 days. She was young, eager, and utterly incompetent. She laid out the wrong waistcoat, forgot to have his boots polished, and had the alarming habit of chattering nervously whenever William entered the room. By the 3rd morning, when she'd somehow managed to starch his cravat so stiffly it chafed his neck, William dismissed her with barely contained irritation. The second lasted a week. She was efficient enough, but had an
unfortunate tendency to rearrange his personal items according to her own logic rather than his preferences. His correspondence ended up filed alphabetically instead of by urgency. His books were organised by size rather than subject. When he'd asked for his grey mourning coat, she'd brought in the charcoal one, insisting they were the same colour. The third made it 9 days before William found her weeping in the corridor, overwhelmed by the complexity of managing a ducal household. By the end of the first month, William had gone through 5 ladies' maids. None of them understood that he preferred his tea at precisely 7 o'clock, not a minute earlier or later. None of them knew that he needed silence in the mornings and preferred his evening clothes laid out by firelight, not lamplight. None of them could anticipate when he needed his study undisturbed and when he needed gentle reminders about social obligations. None of them were Veronica. The realization crept upon him slowly, insidiously. At first, it was simply annoyance at the household's declining efficiency. Then it became something darker, heavier. He found himself pausing at the door to his chambers, expecting to see her there, arranging his morning things with quiet competence. He'd turn to make a comment about some trivial matter, only to remember she was gone. Worst of all was the silence. The new maids either chattered nervously or maintained such rigid formality that the air felt thick with tension. Veronica had known how to be present without being intrusive, how to share a space with him in comfortable quiet. She'd understood that he didn't always need conversation. Sometimes he'd simply needed not to be alone. He hadn't realized how much he depended on that presence until it was gone. 6 weeks after her departure, William stood in his chambers, staring at the chaos of his wardrobe. The current maid, number 7, or was it 8, had mixed his evening clothes with his morning attire, creating a confused jumble that would have made Veronica wince. Veronica would have fixed this in minutes. Veronica would have had everything organized, labeled, perfect. Veronica would have... William stopped himself, jaw clenching. Why was he still thinking about her? She was a servant, a replaced servant. One of the theoretical 50 he could hire. Except he couldn't seem to find even one adequate replacement. He called for his steward that evening, intending to request Veronica's forwarding address for a reference inquiry. Surely some detail in her employment file would indicate where she'd gone. "I'm afraid Miss Kroger left no forwarding information, Your Grace," the steward reported, consulting his records with a troubled frown. "No family address, no next destination. She simply left." Something cold slithered down William's spine. "What do you mean, no information? Everyone leaves information." "Not Miss Kroger, Your Grace. She collected her final wages, took her belongings, and departed." The night butler noted she had a hired carriage waiting, paid for in advance, heading toward the London road. But after that... The steward spread his hands helplessly. Nothing? William stared at him, a strange panic beginning to build in his chest. She'd vanished. Completely. As though she'd never existed at all. No trace, no forwarding address, no family connections listed in her employment records. He dismissed her so easily, so carelessly, never imagining that she might actually disappear from his reach entirely. That night, alone in his perfectly appointed chambers, William finally admitted the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. The hollow feeling in his chest wasn't irritation at household inefficiency. It wasn't frustration with incompetent servants. It was loss. He'd lost something irreplaceable. And in his arrogance, he hadn't realized it until she was already gone. And now, with growing horror, he understood that he had no idea how to find her.
or if she'd even want to be found. The Duke of Ravenshire, who commanded everything and everyone around him with absolute authority, had finally encountered something beyond his control, and it was destroying him. The cottage stood at the edge of Polreath, a tiny fishing village clinging to Cornwall's windswept coast like a barnacle to rock. It had 2 rooms, a smoking fireplace, and a view of the grey-green sea that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Veronica had paid 3 months' rent in advance, with nearly half her savings, leaving her just enough to survive until she could establish some source of income. It was perfect. It was terrifying. It was hers.
Mrs. Kroger, is it?
The landlady, Mrs. Pascoe, had examined her with shrewd but not unkind eyes.
Widow, you said?
Yes. Veronica had practiced the lie during the long coach journey south.
My husband was a merchant sailor. His ship went down off Gibraltar 6 months ago.
The timeline was deliberately vague, calculated to explain both her solitary state and the pregnancy that would soon become impossible to hide. Mrs. Pascoe had clicked her tongue sympathetically and asked no further questions. In small coastal villages, the sea claimed enough husbands that widows' weeds were a common sight. Within a week, Veronica had established her story among the villagers. She kept to herself, polite but reserved, the grieving widow still too fresh in her loss to seek company. She took in sewing and mending, her genteel needlework skills, learned in a different life, proving valuable in a village where most women had hands roughened by fish gutting and net mending. The work was simple but steady. A torn sail here, a Sunday dress requiring alteration there. She charged modest prices and delivered impeccable work. Slowly, cautiously, she built a fragile new life from the ruins of her old one. By October, her condition could no longer be concealed beneath loose shawls and careful posture. The village women began leaving small
Gifts at her door. A jar of preserves, a loaf of fresh bread, a bundle of knitted baby clothes.
They knew the particular loneliness of bearing a child without a husband, even if they believed hers dead rather than simply indifferent. Veronica discovered, to her surprise, that she wasn't miserable. Exhausted, yes. Terrified of the future, certainly. But there was something profoundly liberating about answering to no one, about making her own decisions, about sitting by her own fire in her own cottage without having to be invisible, without having to anticipate someone else's needs before acknowledging her own. In the evenings, she would sit by the window watching the sunset over the water, one hand resting on her growing belly, feeling the flutter of movement within.
We're going to be all right,
she'd whisper.
somehow. We'll be all right.
But the peace was fragile, built on lies and hope, and the desperate prayer that William would never find her. Because the child was beginning to make itself known in ways beyond her swelling belly. She'd catch herself in the small mirror above her washstand and see hints of what was coming. The stubborn set of the jaw, the particular arch of the eyebrow. Shell family traits, bred through generations of aristocratic marriages. What would she do when the baby was born with those unmistakable features? How would she explain grey-green eyes in a child whose supposed father had been brown-eyed? How would she account for the aristocratic bone structure that would become more pronounced as the child grew? At night, she dreamed of William. Sometimes he was the cold duke, dismissing her with casual cruelty. Sometimes he was the broken man who'd held her in the darkness, seeking comfort from grief. And sometimes, most troubling of all, he was searching for her, riding through storms, calling her name with desperate urgency. She always woke from those dreams with tears on her cheeks and her hand pressed protectively over her belly. "He won't find us," she'd whisper to the child. "And even if he does, he won't want us. We're replaceable, remember?
One of 50.
But even as she said it, even as she tried to convince herself, a traitorous part of her heart wondered. What if he did want us? What if he came looking? What if he realized his mistake? Then she'd remember the ice in his eyes, the dismissive wave of his hand, the absolute certainty in his voice when he declared her replaceable. No. Better to build this new life, humble though it was, than to hope for miracles from a man who'd already proven himself incapable of seeing her worth. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, and Veronica smiled despite everything.
Just us, she whispered. That's enough. It has to be enough.
William hired the first investigator in November, 2 months after Veronica's departure. A discreet man named Thornbury, who specialized in locating missing persons for London's elite. She can't have simply vanished, William insisted,
pacing his study while Thornbury took notes. Check the employment registries. Question the coaching inns along the London road. Someone must have seen her. Thornbury returned 3 weeks later with nothing. No Veronica Kroger registered for employment in London or the surrounding counties. No one matching her description had taken long-term lodging at any respectable boarding house. The coaching inn records showed a woman of her general appearance boarding a coach headed south, but the trail went cold at the next major junction. William hired a second investigator, then a third. He sent men to every employment agency in England, offered rewards for information, had his solicitors discreetly inquire among the servant networks that connected great houses across the country. Nothing. It was as though she'd been swallowed by the earth itself. By December, William's obsession had become the talk of his household. He barely slept, spending his nights reviewing investigator reports and maps, trying to divine where a woman with limited means and no family connections might flee. He grew thin, haggard, his famous control fraying at the edges. "Your Grace," his steward ventured one evening, "perhaps Miss Kroger wishes not to be found. Perhaps it would be better to—" "No!" William's voice was sharp, final. "I must find her." But why? The question haunted him during sleepless nights. What would he say if he found her? What could he possibly say that would undo the damage he'd done? The truth crept up on him slowly, painfully, during those long months of searching. It wasn't about replacing an efficient servant. It had never been about that. He thought about the night Richard died, about standing in her doorway, shattered and desperate, about the way she'd let him in, without judgment or hesitation. She hadn't seen the Duke of Ravenshire that night. She'd seen William, just William, broken and human and in need of comfort. And she'd given it freely, asking nothing in return. He thought about 3 years of her quiet presence, the way she'd made his cold, perfectly ordered life somehow bearable, the way she'd known when he needed silence and when he needed the gentle sound of another person moving through his space, the way she'd protected his privacy, his dignity, his secrets, even when he'd given her no reason to be loyal. He thought about the morning after Richard's death, about the cowardice that had made him pretend nothing had happened, about rebuilding walls to protect himself from vulnerability while leaving her to face whatever consequences might come from that night alone. She'd asked him if it meant nothing, and he'd denied even remembering it. God, what had he done? The realization hit him one January night while sitting in his empty chambers, another useless investigator report on his desk. He'd been cruel. Deliberately, calculatedly cruel. Because acknowledging that night, acknowledging his need for her, his dependence on her, his feelings for her, would have meant admitting he wasn't as controlled and superior as he pretended to be. He dismissed her, not because she was replaceable, but because she was irreplaceable. Because she'd seen him vulnerable, and he couldn't bear for anyone to have that power over him. So he'd destroyed her to protect himself. William buried his face in his hands, the weight of his actions finally crushing through his aristocratic armor. He'd lost the only person who'd ever truly known him, the only person who'd looked past his title and his wealth and his carefully maintained facade to see the lonely, frightened man underneath. And she'd walked away with nothing. No security, no references that were worth anything, no acknowledgement of what they'd shared. She'd walked away with dignity as her only possession, and he'd let her go rather than admit he needed her. More than needed. God help him. He'd loved her, and been too much of a coward to admit it, even to himself. "I'll find you," he whispered to the empty room. "And when I do, I won't ask you to come back. I'll just tell you I'm sorry. That you were never replaceable. That I was wrong about everything." Outside, snow began to fall over Ravenshire Hall, blanketing the world in white. And somewhere in England, Veronica carried his child, building a life without him. He had to find her. Not to control or command or fix, simply to beg for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. The telegram arrived on a March evening while William was reviewing yet another fruitless report. Located in Polreath, Cornwall. V. Kroger, residing as Mrs. Kroger, widow, cottage at Cliff's Edge, Thornbury. William was on horseback within the hour, riding through gathering storm clouds toward the coast. He pushed his mount mercilessly, changing horses at posting inns, barely stopping for rest. The journey that should have taken 3 days took less than 2. By the time he reached Polreath, rain lashed the coast with violent fury, and he was soaked to the bone, half mad with exhaustion and desperate hope. The cottage was exactly as Thornbury had described. Small, weathered, perched at the village edge where land met sea. Candlelight flickered in the window. She was there. After 8 months of searching, of going slowly insane with grat and longing, she was finally within reach. William dismounted, his legs nearly buckling. He'd rehearsed 1,000 speeches during the ride, but now, standing at her door with rain streaming down his face, every word's fled his mind. He knocked. Footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps. The door opened, and William's entire world stopped. Veronica stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her dark hair losses and long remembered. But his body, her clearly, unmistakably, heavily pregnant body that drove the air from his lungs like a physical blow. 8 months pregnant. The refusal crashed over him with the force of the storm. That night, Richard's death. 3 months before he'd dismissed her. The timeline aligned with horrifying clarity. "No," he whispered. "No, Veronica. You didn't. You couldn't have." Her face went pale, then flushed with fury. "Get away from here! You're carrying my child." It wasn't a question. The truth was written in every line of her body. In the defensive way her hand moved to her swollen belly. In the grey-green eyes that stared at him with barely contained rage. "You were pregnant when I dismissed you. When I told you that you were replaceable. When I—" Oh, God. "Leave!" Her voice shook. "Leave, now, before I call for help."
You were alone. William's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees in the mud before her door, rain pouring over him, looking up at her with anguished comprehension. You've been alone this entire time, carrying my child. And I called you replaceable. I cast you out with nothing. Yes. The word was sharp as a blade. You did all of that. So why are you here now? Come to claim your property? Come to drag me back to avoid scandal? Come to remind me once again how utterly insignificant I am? No. William shook his head violently, water streaming down his face, rain mixed with tears he didn't bother to hide. I came to beg your forgiveness. I came to tell you that I was wrong about everything, that you were never replaceable, that I've spent 8 months losing my mind trying to find you, not to control you, but just to tell you I'm sorry. But I was a coward and a fool, and that I destroyed the only real thing I've ever had because I was too afraid to admit I needed you. Needed? Veronica laughed bitterly. You needed a servant. You needed someone to anticipate your preferences and maintain your comfort and disappear when convenient. I needed you, William said desperately. Not a servant. You, Veronica. The woman who saw me broken and didn't turn away. The woman who gave me comfort when I was drowning in grief. The woman I fell in love with and was too much of a coward to admit it, even to myself. Silence. Just the sound of rain and wind and the distant crash of waves. You love me, Veronica said flatly. How convenient. You love me now that you found me pregnant and alone. Now that there's a scandal to contain. Now that I loved you before. The words tore out of him. I loved you that night. I loved you every day for 3 years, and I was terrified of it. Terrified of needing someone, of being vulnerable, of admitting that a servant, that you, had become the most important person in my world. So I destroyed it. I destroyed us, and I've been dying ever since. He reached out, hands shaking, not to touch her but in supplication. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm just asking, begging, for a chance to be the man you and our child deserve. Let me take care of you. Let me prove that I can be more than the arrogant bastard who broke your heart. Please, Veronica, please.
She stood there, one hand on her belly, looking down at him with an expression he couldn't read. The man who'd once commanded her with absolute authority was kneeling in the mud, broken and pleading, offering her everything. And Veronica had to decide: protect herself and their child from further heartbreak, or risk trusting him one more time. The late afternoon sun spilled gold across Ravensshire Hall's gardens, transforming them into something from a fairy tale. Veronica stood at the French doors of the drawing room, one hand resting on her swollen belly, watching their son chase butterflies through the roses with the determined enthusiasm of a 4-year-old who believed he could catch anything. Mama! Mama, look! Richard, named for the uncle he'd never meet, the uncle whose death had inadvertently given him life, held up a flower he'd picked, his grey-green eyes bright with pride. It's beautiful, darling, Veronica called back, her heart swelling with a joy so profound, it still sometimes took her breath away. 5 years. 5 years since that stormy March night, when William had collapsed in the mud outside her cottage, broken and pleading. 5 years since she'd made the hardest decision of her life, to trust him one more time, to believe that people could change, that love could redeem even the deepest wounds. She'd been right, and wrong, and right again in ways she'd never imagined. Warm arms encircled her from behind, William's hands coming to rest over hers on her belly. Their second child, a daughter, if the midwife's predictions held true, kicked vigorously,
as though protesting the confinement. "She has your spirit," William murmured against her hair. "Already so determined." "She has your stubbornness," Veronica countered, leaning back against his chest. "There's a difference." He laughed, the sound still capable of surprising her after all these years. The Duke, who'd rarely smiled, now laughed daily, his severe features transformed by genuine warmth. The cold, silent halls of Ravenshire had been gradually filled with light, music, laughter, and love. So much love that sometimes Veronica wondered how these walls had ever contained only loneliness. The transformation hadn't been instant or easy. That first year had been fraught with difficulty. William learning to be vulnerable, Veronica learning to trust again. Both of them navigating the scandal of a duke marrying his former lady's maid, while she was visibly pregnant. Society had been predictably vicious. Many doors had closed. But William had faced it all with a humility that had surprised even his harshest critics. He'd stood before the House of Lords and declared his love for Veronica openly, daring anyone to challenge his choice. He'd introduced her as his Duchess with pride, defended her against whispers and cuts, and slowly, grudgingly, society had accepted what it couldn't change. More importantly, he'd kept every promise he'd made that night in Cornwall. He'd
Proven, day after day, year after year, that she was irreplaceable. That their son was cherished. That the family they'd created was the foundation of his entire world. "Do you ever regret it?" William asked softly, his voice carrying the vulnerability he no longer tried to hide from her. "Giving me that second chance?" Veronica turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd broken her heart, and then spent 5 years proving he could be trusted with it again. The silver at his temples was new, earned through sleepless nights with a colicky infant, and the weight of becoming the father and husband he'd never thought himself capable of being. "Every day," she said, watching his eyes widen with hurt before she smiled. "Every day, I'm grateful I did. Every day, I see the man you became when you stopped being afraid. Every day, I fall in love with you all over again." His exhale was shaky with relief and emotion. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "You were never replaceable, my love. You were always the only one. I was just too much of a fool to see it until I'd lost you." "You found me again," Veronica whispered. "And I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserve you." Their kiss was gentle, sweet, full of the history they'd survived and the future they'd built together. Young Richard's delighted shriek of, "Papa's kissing Mama again!" broke them apart, both laughing. William swept their son into his arms, the boy's flower crushed between them. And together, the three of them, soon to be 4, stood in the golden afternoon light. The Duke of Ravenshire had once believed that everyone was replaceable, that distance was safety, that control was everything. He'd been catastrophically wrong. And in being wrong, in being broken and humbled and redeemed by love, he'd found something far more valuable than pride or power. He'd found home. Veronica watched her husband tickle their son until the boy's laughter echoed through the gardens, and felt their daughter kick against her ribs, and knew with absolute certainty some things, some people, were irreplaceable. And love, real love, was worth every risk.